Welcome, chess friends. On February 18, Jan Timman passed away at the age of 74. He was a Dutch chess legend, for a short moment, number 2 in the world, but for a long time considered best of the West, after Kasparov and Karpov. Today I want to discuss his books that are available on Forward Chess. That's my favorite chess ebook reader. Here you can see the books, Timman's Studies, 186 studies that Timman himself composed, Timman's Triumphs, his 100 best games, 100 endgame studies you must know, and then you can see his books about Bobby Fischer, about the Curaçao tournament in 1962, a book about the battle between Kasparov and Karpov, Timman's Titans, about his memories and his competition with other world champions, and a book on Max Euwer's best games, the only Dutch world champion. Today I'm going to focus on the first three. And before we go there, I want to mention that if you look to this book, Timman's Studies, it's available on Forward Chess for $24. So you can have it in a digital format like this. But there's also a very special offer. Here you can see the New in Chess store, and they are offering a hardcover signed by Timman himself for 45 euros. So I think it's really special that this book was released at the end of November. At that moment, Timman was already aware that he would not survive his illness, and so he was signing the books, and so you can get his latest book from that moment when it was released, and you will have a signed copy for in your own library. Before we go to the contents, I just want to highlight also the following. What is better than hearing me talk about the book? It's hearing Jan Timman talk about the book in his interview with Dirk-Jan ten Geuzendam. And if you look at Timman's studies, my collected endgame studies and their origins, it's 450 pages, 186 endgame studies, composed in a period of more than half a century between 1971 and 2025, and 31 completely new studies. So listen to this podcast. It's available, podcast 82 from New in Chess, and listen to the interview by Dirk-Jan ten Geuzendam with Dutch legend Jan Timman. So let me just show the book, Timman's Studies. And you can see how it is ordered. It goes through the years. And then at the end, chapter 7, we have the new unpublished studies. Let's shortly look at the preface, because it tells a lot. So for Timman, chess was sport, art, and science. And in endgame studies, in which mistakes may never occur, the scientific aspect is paramount. So his father was a mathematician, and you can see that they both had an interest for science. With the rise of computers and very strong engines, you would perhaps say that the composition of endgame studies is less interesting. For Timman, it was the reverse. It sparked his enthusiasm for endgame play. And he also worked on trying to save endgame studies that were correct and that were incorrect, and that engines proved to be incorrect, and to save them for the culture of chess. When you look at studies, right, if you are, of course, someone who composes it itself, it's a lot about the themes of the study, and it's very important that there is like an economical starting position with no superfluous material. So there is something about the efficiency for people who are composing endgame studies that is very important, and it's focused around the themes and how they have been brought to life. So I think this is like a really amazing book. I can fully recommend it. You can get it in hardcover signed, or you can get it on Forward Chess. 450 pages for $24. So that is really amazing. Then let's get to the 100 endgames you must know. So when you look, like I said, for people who compose, it's about the themes, and it's about, you could say, the efficiency of the study, no superfluous pieces, no superfluous moves. Of course, when you look for, you could say, like a typical club player, right? It's different. I think they look more to the practical aspect and to the beauty of the endgame study. So there are 100 endgame studies in order of increasing degree of difficulty, and you can see that there are a lot of themes like the Reti maneuver, Saavedra, the Lasker maneuver, which are being explained here. And at first, I have to say, I thought that new in chess, but using this 100 endgames you must know from Jesus Lavilla theme, the bestseller, for this whole series, I was a bit reluctant, but I started looking into the book. And when you just look at the elementary endings, right, I think they are so interesting. So you can see here, right? An endgame like this, it feels like a very practical endgame. And what is so special about everything that Timman writes, right? So even if you look to something like this, there's always a story, right? He says, I remember I was giving the starting position as an exercise when I was 11 and found the solution immediately as I knew how the distant opposition worked. So this is, of course, his memory, but it's like in everything that he writes, there's such a richness in stories and context based on more than half a century of being on the top of the world in chess. So let me just show you, right? So these are, you could say, they have practical value, they're beautiful, and I think you learn certain themes that are associated with it, right? So here you can see the table of contents, elementary endings, then they go down to classical studies, and then finally there are more complicated studies, right? And I just want to highlight a few. So I was talking about the 100 endgames you must know. So let's see some of those themes, right? And also this highlights the storylines, right? If you look to this puzzle, the story behind the study is fascinating. It's an illustration of a fairly weak amateur chess player becoming world famous. It started with a game between two British amateurs in 1875, which was agreed drawn in a position that was winning for white. 2 decades later, George Barbier, in his column The Glasgow, Weekly Citizen published the final position as an exercise, white to play and win. In his next column, he moved the black king from the h file to a1, and now it was black to play and draw. The Spanish priest, Fernando Saavedra, who lived in Scotland, saw the column and discovered that white could win after all. Thus the Saavedra motive was born. The study version is by Emanuel Lasker, who added white's first move. So I think this is very interesting to read. All this background, and you learn the classical themes. And in this case, right, they have also practical value. So it's a combination of practical value, beauty, storylines. Stories are the fabric of life. And I think that makes it very enjoyable to read. So that's the book that I was discussing, 100 Endgames Studies You Must Know. And finally, in my Perpetual Chess podcast interview that is being released this Tuesday, I was discussing this game, and also here it stands out the storylines, right? So you can see here, these are based on the 100 best games of Jan Timman. So he describes, in those days, opening theory hadn't developed very far in most of the lines. My preparation for my second round game versus Ribley was short. So in Chess Informant, I had seen a game by Vito Lynch, in which he had made a stunning sacrifice. That was enough reason for me to follow the example of this attacking artist. And then he continues always, right? There's always a twist. After my return from Nick 6, I phoned two of my chess friends, Genna Sosonko and Hans Verhegen, to inform them about the course of that game. Transfer of information was scarce in those days. When I mentioned the move 18 knight takes f6, both friends reacted, "That's not possible, you've mixed up the moves." I really had to convince them that this was in fact how the game had gone. So when I was playing my Simul over 40 years ago, and I made this draw against Timman, we played this line, and then afterwards we discussed the analysis that was published in 1980 in the Russian magazine 64. And it just shows, right, you have a world-class player who's willing to share his passion with an amateur player. And this is, so here we have the poison pawn variation, and I was on the black side. And this was the sacrifice. And I think there's also here again great beauty. And it was followed up. You can see who else played it: Kasparov, Hübner, Beljavsky. And I think the special thing is that after you sacrifice a full piece, right, on the king's side, you play this move c4. It looks like a very quiet pawn move, but of course the idea is that you limit the activity of the queen on a4, and the queen on a4 is no longer in the game. But it was an amazing find if you consider that there was no chess base. Right? He also said that the information resources were scarce. There were no engines, and this was discovered and found and then played multiple times. And I think it's very beautiful that you have this combination of a piece sacrifice followed by a quiet pawn move. So regarding this Timman triumphs, right, there's also, of course, if you want to know more about it, an interview, episode 196, by Ben Johnson on the Perpetual Chess podcast, in which he interviews Jan Timman about his book. And of course, you hear a lot of stories from Jan Timman. So to come back on the library of Jan Timman in Forward Chess. Recently published Timman Studies. You can get it for $24, 450 pages. Timman Triumphs is there, also recent, 100 best games. 100 Endgame Studies you must know. I think it's a really fun book and beautiful stories and also practical. And of course there are other books by Jan Timman too. So thank you, Jan Timman, for everything that you contributed to the chess world. And I hope that you enjoyed this review. Thank you. Bye-bye.